record. Okay, sorry about that. For those of you online, the folks over here already got my spiel. Yeah, doing that right now. There we go. Okay, Joe, can you hear me now?
Loud and clear. Please take it
Okay,
away.
sorry about that.
Good morning.
Now that I got all emotional, I've got to do it again. Sorry.
It's all right.
And by the way, folks, my colleagues, Joseph Tan and Chris Williams, and I believe, Milo, are you on as well?
Yes, I am. Hi, Brandy.
Okay, perfect. Those are all my colleagues at the Department of Education, and they are going to be monitoring all of the questions in the Zoom chat. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. So for those of you online, and I apologize for you guys because you're gonna have to hear this again for a second. The reason that you're actually here today is for kids like my daughter, Ariana. So my daughter, 3 years old, went to Bowling Green Charter School, and she's got cerebral palsy, and she graduated from high school in 2009. And so behind all of the work that you guys do, there is a child and a student behind those data. And so it's data collection, not just for the sake of data collection, but it's improving outcomes for students with disabilities, just like my daughter, Ariana. And so I value the work that you all do. I value the work that I do, because I love my job. I love it, right? And helping you guys improve those data is really important because you want the data to tell your story.
Drop your mic for a minute and test it. We're getting an echo with the microphone.
Okay. Test, test, test. Check, check, check. Is that better? If I keep it away a little bit, so folks online.
Away from this.
Okay, I will step away from the speaker. Is that better? Check, 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 test, test, test. Is there an echo? Or should I just not use the mic? Okay.
I'm getting any responses that I'll watch them.
Okay, so I'll continue to use it, but I just won't keep it up to my, put it up closer. So it's really important that your data tell your story. So how many of you have seen on the dashboard or a data quest or when those of you that work with the federal indicators for IDEA, where you're looking at those data and it's not really reflective of what you guys are actually doing, right? Yeah, so there's instances where that happens, and it's not because you guys are not doing a good job. It's just because the data collection, a lot of the data are bad, right? And so we're here to teach you about improving the quality of your data at the local level. And that means improving sometimes processes and people, right? So we're going to talk about it ad nauseum today. So I apologize in advance. For those of you that are new, these are the acronyms that you're going to see throughout this presentation and that I'm going to use. Okay, so anytime you see these acronyms, this is what they mean. SWDS, Student with Disabilities. SEDS, Special Education Data System. So when you hear me say that, or when you hear me say vendor, typically I'm talking about SACE. Okay, and I will say SACE because you guys are all SACE districts in this instance. SIS, Student Information System, ARIES, school-wise, whatever schools, whatever student information system you're using. IEP, ISP, and IFSP, those are all the plans for those of you that are on the SIS side. Those are the special education plans that students with disabilities are typically put on when they enter special education. SPED and SSRV, Special Education File, Student Services File. Those files are the files you guys currently submit to CALPADS. There's only 2 of them. Now on the right-hand side here is all of the new files. So Students with Disabilities Status, Meetings File, Plan File, Services File. We're going to talk a lot about those today. And then API, Application Program Interface, that's essentially the way that SACE sends records up to CALPADS. This is an electronic transfer of data. Okay. And then finally, LEA. I'm just going to put this down because you guys can hear me okay, right? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So just when you thought you had everything figured out, right? You're like, yeah, man, I got my bed records in there. I figured out how to resolve all my errors. I was, you know, I know how to review the report. We're changing everything again. Okay. But there's a reason that we're doing it. Okay. So, many of you, especially those of you that were here during the case miss to CALPADS transition, know how painful that was. Okay. So in case miss, how many times a year did you guys have to worry about submitting data to the state? Twice. Okay. And it was one record that you submitted for the student. And it had all of the data pretty much in there. And it was table A. Everybody remember table A in case miss? Okay. So that was point in time data collection. And typically, when did you start gathering the data to report to the state? Okay, it was due December 1st and June 30th. November 1st, right? It was like you'd start the month before and start getting ready, and then you get it certified. And there were obviously issues with that system as well, but it was a lot easier, right? Because you only had to worry about it twice a year. The reason that it was painful transitioning cases into CALPADS is because CALPADS is what we call a transactional system. So does anybody want to take a guess at what I mean when I say transactional?
Every time that there's a meeting, something changes and they have to report.
Exactly. Every time there's an event that happens in your special education data system, we expect those data to come up to CALPADS. And there's a reason that we collect it more often. What do you think some of those reasons are? Primarily, what's the reason? Why do we collect it more often? Even though you're only certifying it again twice a year. Sure, changes in disability and services. But does CDA, do we utilize it throughout the year? And if we do, what do we use it for? Anybody know?
The dashboard.
Not necessarily the dashboard. The dashboard, we use certified data at the end of the year. Yeah.
Well, funding.
Potentially, right? And so there's a couple of things that we use it for. Remember that enrollments in CALPADS are happening on a daily basis. The kids are transferring to and from your districts. So we use it to not only provide you guys information about whether or not that student was on an IEP and give you information about that student from the district that they came from, but we also use it for monitoring. We use it for statutory compliance to make sure that you guys hold timely meetings. And our focus monitoring and technical assistance teams, or FMTA teams, are pulling those data on a monthly basis to make sure that you guys are holding your meetings on time. Okay, so they're using those data that you're sending up. So is there anybody that does not send data up on at least a weekly basis? And it's okay if you don't. Okay, so daily. Okay, some of you are doing it daily. Is there anybody that does it less than weekly? Okay, so monthly. And you do it monthly. Okay. So remember that even if you're doing it monthly, you could miss that deadline where they pull those records, make sure that you're holding your statutory meeting. So we actually advise you to send the data up on at least a weekly basis. Okay. But that's one of the reasons that that big Fed record that we designed does not work in CALPADS. Because CALPADS is a transactional system. We look at the data and use it on an ongoing basis. So part of the reason, and here's one of the reasons that that big giant SPED record in the current architecture doesn't work. Because we actually need data from you guys for 3 different purposes. So the first thing is a student eligible for special education services? And when does it start? And when does it end? When is their eligibility and participation dates? Okay. Second, we just talked about that statutory meeting compliance. Are you holding meetings in a timely manner? Okay, are your initials done within 60 days? Your annuals, are they done at least once a year? Your triennial evaluations, are you doing those at least once every 3 years? And then finally, what are the LRE components, the least restrictive environment components of that student's plan? What does their program say? What is their gen ed percentage? Have their transition indicators been populated in their IEPs? Have those goals been populated in their IEPs? So those are 3 different purposes and uses of the data. And particularly the LRE components are used for reporting for IDEA and the generation of your indicators in those federal indicators for IDEA. Now, the other reason that this is problematic, and the current architecture is problematic, anyone want to take a guess at how many fields, date fields in particular, are in our current SPED file? How many date fields do we capture in that one file? Just guess. Around 10. It's close to that. So we collect 6 different dates in that file. Okay, that file is our biggest file in CALPADS. There are 47 columns of data that we collect in that one file, and it's a lot. And when you have all of those dates, and the dates are referral dates, parental consent for evaluation date, initial entry date, meeting date, amendment date, exit date. You have to think about a data system having to evaluate every single date that's in that record to make sure that it's valid. And then it compares the dates against each other within the same record. And sometimes when you're submitting multiple records for the same student, it has to compare those records, and it has to compare with data that are already in the system. So that is very confusing for CALPADS to do. And sometimes it does not get it right, which is why in your child count reports and your federal setting reports, sometimes kids will be in there that should not be, or they're missing, right? They're not missing because CALPADS is not currently smart enough to pick the right record. And it's primarily because of the way we architected that record, the way we designed it. It doesn't really work. Also, eligibility starts and ends. So how many of you have direct access into CALPADS and can look at the SPED record in CALPADS? Okay, so almost all of you do. When you log into CALPADS and you go to that special education section, so you type in a student's SSID, you look at the special education section, how many records are there for some of those kids? There's a lot. Okay, every time there's an amendment, a meeting, every time a student transfers and adopts the transaction. But is there a really clean way to look at all of those records and say, this is when they started and this is when they exited the plan? There's not, right? You really have to do some digging. So if you have a hard time doing it and I have a hard time doing it, then CALPADS is definitely going to have a hard time. Okay, so we cannot really, and for reporting purposes, when we try and pull the data out for the dashboard, they have a hard time figuring out start and end dates for kids. The multiple records and multiple dates within those make it really hard to validate. And finally, but most importantly, it does not mirror what your business looks like locally. Okay, we didn't really do enough research on the back end to figure out how you guys conduct these meetings, what that might look like so that it would impact the way we design the file. And so we've been talking over the last few years with SELPAs and LEAs and trying to get a better sense of how we can redesign this so it makes it much easier and it'll simplify reporting and validation. Okay, so this model is going to look more like the way you guys do business or the way you should do business. Because what has happened over the years since we transitioned these data is that oftentimes your case managers are having to change the way they do things just so the records will come up to CALPADS correctly. Okay, so one example. Why can't I exit a student in a triennial meeting? Like if they're being evaluated, if they're ineligible now, I want to be able to exit them on that record. And CALPADS says, no, you can't do that. You have to put it on an annual. So you either have to create an annual with the same date as the triennial, so you can exit them, Or you have to go back into the most recent IEP and put the exit date there, okay? And from a business perspective, does that make sense?
No.
It probably drives your case managers absolutely crazy, okay? So this new model is gonna more closely mirror what you guys do. And all of the data that we need for all of those different purposes are now separated into distinct files because it's gonna simplify the reporting. So the meetings file is only gonna be used for your monitoring report. So 16.7 and 16.8, where it's showing which kids have late meetings. That's the only use of that file. That's the only time we're gonna use it. Your plan file and students with disability status file, that's gonna inform your child count reports or your federal setting report, okay? Those are gonna be used for those purposes. So it's gonna simplify reporting. And all of the dates that are within those files are just related to that file. So for example, if I send up a students with disability status file, and I'm sending up a status of eligible and participating, the status start date means the date that that student became eligible and participating. It's directly related to that. In the plan file, the plan effective date is the date that the student started services. Okay. In the meetings file, if I have a meeting date in there, it's the date that that statutory meeting was held. Okay, so there's not a lot of confusion about all of the different dates in these files. So here are the specific changes. We've got 3 new files. That SPED file is going away. Okay. Now you're going to be submitting 3 new files that take the place of the SPED file. So students with disability status, which is the state of a student's eligibility and participation in special education. The meetings file, which is in green, is the date that you held your statutory meeting and the date that that meeting was initiated. Okay, so that's really an important thing because we do not want meetings sent up that don't reset that clock for your annuals and triennials or tell us whether or not you held your initials within 60 days. We don't want that. Okay, so we only want statutory meetings. Then plan, that's really the IEP, the components of the IEP. And what I'm going to tell you is the only time CDE wants that plan record is when the parent has consented for services and some version of the offer of faith. It's not the full offer of faith. Okay, we don't want those plan records to come up if the parent has not approved something. Okay, so in cases where you make the offer of faith and you're recording the offer of faith locally, but the parent does not agree at all to anything, we would not expect anything to come up to CALPADS until the parent has agreed to something. Yes.
That agreement can be written or only, or can it be a verbal?
So it's informed consent is the IDEA law, and that could be verbal or written. But having said that, in Sonoma County, you guys probably have local policies about what you require in order to start services, particularly after an initial. Sherry, did you want to say anything about that? Written, it has to be written. Okay. But the IDEA statute basically says informed consent. Okay, the services file, SSRV, is pretty much the same. We're just giving it a new acronym, and the link between the plan, the IEP document, and the services that are associated with that is now something called the plan effective start date. Okay, so anybody remember the meeting or amendment identifier that's in the current file? Okay, how fun is that feeling? Like, it's like 700 characters long. It's helpful. It's really helpful. Well, somebody else said that too. Like, it's helpful because it has like the SSID and the.
But like when you're cleaning up error,
Okay, so she relies on because what she's talking about is your vendors basically put a bunch of different, like the local ID and the SSID and the meeting date, and it's a bunch of data pushed, concatenated together, right? So she can figure out which records that she's looking at or which kid based on that meeting or amendment identifier. So, but we're getting rid of it because now we are. But yes, right, we're getting rid of it because the link now between the IEP and the associated services is the plan effective start date. What's the date that those services started? And then for that same SSID and reporting LEA, we're looking for that same plan effective date in the service. Okay, and it'll start to make more sense because again, now we've broken apart a lot of these pieces of data. So when is all this happening? You are going to start sending up those new file types, SWDS, plan, meeting, and services, on September 19th. And I apologize, it's not in this slide deck because I developed this before they had actually come up with the date. So September 19th, your vendors are going to start pushing these files up to CALPADS. Okay. In SAFE, they are not currently sending up any records to CALPADS for any transactions that occurred July 1st, 2023 and after. They're not doing it. So on the 19th is when all your transactions are going to go up for anything that's happened July 1st and after. Yes.
Okay, then there's gonna be a major problem with our district, because we will already be past the 30 days for the ELAP.
Okay. That's perfect segue. I was just getting ready to address it. So this actually came up in Riverside County, which was the very first session that I did. And what she's referring to is the current SPED record and the information in your IEP systems needs to go up to CALPAD to tell TOMS, the testing system, that a student is a student with disabilities. And particularly if they're English learners, right? Or if they could be English learners, because they need to get their designated accommodations and designated support in TOMS. And that's the only way they do it, is if CALPADS knows they're a student with disabilities. So here's the group that we're talking about. Have they been initially evaluated for Part B? That's important. Okay, and were they determined to be eligible? And did the parent accept the offer? Okay, so if they're eligible and participating, and they had an initial evaluation for Part B, and they're in grade kindergarten or transitional kindergarten all the way through 12, then you need to talk to SAFE because they did generate SPED records for students who made those criteria or met those criteria, but you have to push them up through the API. Okay, so but it's only SPED records in the legacy format. You have to send them up right now. They're not creating SPED records for everybody. They're just doing it for that set of for contact SAFE. They sent out communication. Did anybody see it on Monday about it? She said they were sending out some communication on Monday about those transactions, but contact SAFE because you can send those up, and you only need the SPED record. You don't need services. Okay. But in the meantime, your vendors are not sending anything up. Okay, on the 19th is when they're going to push everything up to CALPADS. So all of the documentation about the file types that I'm going to be talking about are in our larger set of documentation here, which is the CALPADS file specifications. So if you go to this link, you can find version 15.0 of the specifications, and we're getting ready to release 15.1. That has all of the field names, it has all of the definitions. The code sets document has all of the values that you find in your drop-down list and what their definitions are. And you may not think that you need it, but I promise you, at some point, you're going to have to refer back to it, because if you're in SAFE and you see a field called student degree of support, what the heck is this, right? And you know, with the state reporting field, you can actually go to the file specifications, you can look up student degree of support, it'll give you a definition, and it'll tell you, oh, by the way, there's a value set, there's a reference set for this, code set. And this is the code set you need to look up. So you go to the code set document, and you see extensive support needs, mild, moderate support needs, and those definitions. So it's going to give you some information. For those of you, women of my age, if you're having insomnia, and apparently you should have just broken out the CALPADS documentation. Would have put you right to sleep. There would have been no right. So it's a lot of information, but just bookmark it, because at some point you're going to need to use it. The valid code combos and error lists, that in combination with one another tells you, gives you some information about errors that you're going to get in CALPADS if, in fact, you don't meet the combinations between certain fields. All right, so the benefits of all these changes. Number one, the SWDS file is now going to give us a really clear start date or when a student was eligible and participating. And then if they subsequently become ineligible, it will have a date for that as well. So we're going to really be able to clearly see the start date of a student's participation in special education and their end date in that status file. Plan and services will now have an effective start date. Okay, so the plan effective start date, as I told you before, is the date that the student starts services. And anytime I'm talking about plan, I'm always talking about those two things together. Okay, because your plan and services will always come up together and they're linked by that plan effective start date. Okay, so what you don't see here is the fact that we also capture what's called a plan effective end date. And you may think, well, we don't see a plan effective end date in the specifications. And that's because what CALPADS is doing is actually deriving the effective end date. Okay, so what that means is if I send up a plan for a student, an IEP, that's effective on July 1st, 2023, they transfer to another district and in September, and on September 1st, that LEA sends up an IEP for the student on September 1st. What CALPADS does is it automatically gives an effective end date to the prior plan. Okay, so now we can really clearly know exactly what plan the student is on information day. Okay, because there will always be a plan that's effective. The records in the plan file will be sequential. You will never have two plan records for the same student with the same effective start date, ever. In fact, if you try to send one up with the same effective start date as a record that's in there, and it's from, say, a different LEA, you're going to get an error. That record will be rejected. Okay, so you're going to see the progression of records, and that includes amendments. It includes adoptions. It includes annual IEPs. It includes any iterations of that plan. Okay, they will all have new effective start dates. Meetings, again, are statutory meetings. And this is the really cool thing about this, but it's going to take some retraining for your case managers. Now, meetings are independent of the student plan. Okay, the fact that a meeting was initiated, that piece of information, did the IEP team convene? Did we meet our statutory requirements? If the answer is yes, you can send that meeting record up to CALPADS, even if the parent has not consented to the plan. Okay, the fact that the parent has consented to the plan or part of the plan is a completely separate component. Okay, so you can send those two things up separately. And what it also means is your meeting date and your plan effective start date are not always going to be the same. Okay, so what are some examples where the date that a plan starts is going to be different than the date you held the meeting? Parent doesn't initially consent. Sometimes I've heard it takes months for parents to agree. Okay, that's the corner case, but sometimes even if it takes a few weeks. Okay, so why is it important? And I referenced this earlier, but why is it important to get those meeting records sent up to CALPADS on a regular basis? Monitoring, it's 16.7 and 16.8, right? If you held the meeting, you should be able to tell us that you held the meeting. So what are some other examples where the meeting date and the plan effective start date would be different?
On an initial,
On an initial and the parent.
it carries over to another meeting.
Okay, yeah, you have continuance meetings, so it's the same. The parent hasn't quite agreed or the IEP team hasn't reached consensus. What are some others? Part C to Part B, right? I'm holding my Part C or my transition meeting 2 years, 9 months, when that kid is 2 years, 9 months, but their plan actually won't start until they're 3. Or what are
Or initial.
Yeah, there's all of those. So if the IEP team convenes, but the parent was a no-show, you met your statutory compliance to have the meeting. If you have to continue it, it just means you can't send up a plan record until the parent has actually agreed to something. Okay, so they're all, and one of the things that has kind of come out of this work, so I gave a presentation to the Advisory Commission on Special Education. And so they were really excited when they saw CALPADS special education redesign on the agenda. No, they weren't excited at all. Some of them were like breaking out their cell phones. They started checking their text messages and email. So as I started going through this presentation, one of the things that immediately caught their attention was this, right? Now I can, as an LEA, as a case manager, I can tell CALPADS that we've met our statutory requirement, we've held the meeting, but we're taking our time in terms of the development of that student's IEP. So as a case manager, it takes kind of the pressure off of me to immediately get signature, because that's when I send that record up to CALPADS, okay? It also takes the pressure off of parents, because I mean, what we're really talking about here is services for our kids. And we want to be really thoughtful and work with the team to make sure that what we agree upon is going to work for my kids. So they really, really like the fact that now these two things can come up separately. But again, CALPADS and CASEMIS have conditioned you guys that you can't send up those records that you held a meeting until you also send up the plan with it. Yes.
I'm just curious what generates the transaction for the beat separately from the plan.
So
It's typically affirming.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I can tell you that when I first started doing these sessions, we've been working with your vendors. Like, we've been working with them really closely. We've had one-on-one meetings with these vendors where we've walked through all of this logic. So when I first started doing these sessions, my understanding initially was that once you hold the meeting, if you know that it's going to take a while for that IEP team to reach consensus and you need to schedule continuance meetings, then you could affirm the meeting and send up the meeting only. And FACE would know, based on other information that you've entered, that the parent hasn't agreed to anything yet. And they would send up that meeting. Then what I initially said was, you would have to go back in once the parent signed, indicate the parent signed, and then reaffirm. And it caused so much confusion. They're like, wait, we have to affirm twice? What are you talking about? So Stace was like incognito. One of the reps was incognito at my Sacramento County session, and she didn't say anything to me. And then we met afterwards, and she said, yeah, you know, I kept hearing that you had been telling people that they need to affirm twice. And I just wanted to hear it for myself. So we met, and that is not the way they're going to do it. Okay, so you're not going to have to reaffirm. You're not going to have to affirm twice, but they have a solution for it. I don't know what it is. So today is the day they're doing their very first training. Okay, but they're also doing another one on September 6th. So SACE does have a solution. Because initially what they were doing is they were having their case managers just affirm right after the meeting was held. If you had, and then they were sending up a plan record even if there was no approval. Okay, and we don't want that. If the parent hasn't agreed to anything, we don't want the offer of faith. Okay, the only time the state wants a plan record is when the parent has agreed to either a partial or full offer of faith. So they're figuring it out, is my point. So SACE will be able to tell you. But I know it won't be affirming twice. Okay, that was incorrect information that I had.
Yeah. Just like standard review, right? The initial you have to, in order to begin services, the parent has time.
Right. It's the same thing, right? So the parent, for initial, you're going to wait until the parent actually signs or agrees to something to send up that plan record. Okay, right now, currently in SACE, what they were doing is, even if the parent, or no, actually initials is the only time that they will not send up yet. But for annuals and triennials, if you're developing new plans at that time, and the parent hasn't agreed, what they were doing is they were just having you affirm it, and they're sending it anyway. They're sending the offer then. And we don't want that, right? We want them to wait until you have either partial or full. So it'll be for all.
Sure. Just for SAFE training on this for 6 and to register, SAFE new section on your dashboard. If you haven't registered, register now or not right now, training. And they'll answer all these questions about what it's going to look like.
And they are recording it, by the way. I was told that they're recording it, and they'll post it in the SAFE website. So, just be aware of that, because I don't work in SAFE. So I can't tell you exactly the buttons you're gonna have to push, but they are aware of, what the business need is. And that is, and part of the problem is that SAFE was designed to be an IEP management system. It was not designed as its primary purpose for state reporting, right? That was sort of a secondary use of this system. And so rather, it's not really, it doesn't store history. It stores transactions, CALPADS transactions, but they're literally only doing that for purposes of state reporting. And so one of the problems right now is that meetings and the IEP document are exactly the same thing in SAFE. The same. A meeting equals an associated document. Okay, and that is an issue in this model, because you need to be able to separate those two things. So we've communicated that to SAFE, and whether or not they'll address it in the future, we'll see.
Brandy, just to point out, we have a couple of questions in the chat, in the question and answer forum.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Questions about SACE, since we're talking about SACE from Itala. What do you mean send up the meeting up? What IEP pages are those in the future? Will you show us a visual sample of this step?
So I can't show you a visual sample. SACE is going to have to do that, right? So definitely, as Sherry said, please sign up for the SACE training. There's one today, but I think it's going on at the same time as this meeting. So September 6th, please register for that training. And they can show you exactly how you would do that.
Okay. Some amendments do not include service changes, so service dates would not change. How would lose them align to the service plan effective start date? Example of this is if the amendment only includes changes to goals.
So every time you're sending up a new plan record, it has to have a new effective start date. The services, there always have to be some services. They can be the exact same services. Even if the services didn't change, remember, the date that we're capturing in that services file is the plan effective start date, not necessarily it's not the service start, okay? Sometimes they're the same in your IEP systems, but sometimes they can be different, right? We're not capturing the service start date, we're capturing the start date of the plan and the associated service.
Okay, just a comment. Any questions in the room? Can we just repeat it so that the Zoom participants could actually hear it?
I'm sorry. And I said that I was really good at, before we started, I was like, oh yeah, I'm really good about that. Apparently not, because I haven't, but yes, I will do that.
Yeah, and then a question related to this. These are parents who do not sign for weeks, months, or even years. Who is tracking all this?
So first of all, it depends on what types of meetings that you're talking about, right? So if it's parents that don't sign the IEP and the student already has something in place, there's already something in stay put. And until that parent agrees to the new plan, we wouldn't expect that to come up. Okay, so that's in place. Now, if it's an initial and it takes a really, really long time, Joe, I don't know if you want to talk about due process.
Right. Well, as far as due process, we have to adhere to the, any escalations to the due process. Obviously, if an IEE is required or any of that nature, then it should be reflected accordingly.
So the point is, if it's an initial evaluation and you still don't have agreement and the parent has not approved, then you can't start services. You just can't. Okay, so that student would continue to show up as eligible but not participating until the parent agreed to something. So if the parent never agrees to anything, then there is a specific process, and Joe and Sherry, you might be able to speak to specifically when they never agree. It just doesn't happen. Do they have to revoke consent?
Yeah, in those regards, it has to follow the due process,
Process.
Brandy.
Yeah. And I'm still
Okay.
learning about that, by the way.
And this is the nice thing about this new SPED redesign, right, Brandy, that you've been preaching right now. It's because we have to distinguish or distinctly decouple the meetings to the plan so that you could report it accordingly as it is reflected or in your on those specific scenarios, rather.
Okay, and remember, guys, we will be able to see that you actually held the meeting. We'll be able to see that. If we don't see a subsequent plan record, and the student status is eligible and not participating, then we actually don't expect to see a plan record until the parent has agreed to something, in which case they become eligible and participating, and then we expect to see a plan. Okay? Yes.
No, question about planning. As that typically will go in when you're making the offer case. And then what I'm hearing you say is that's really going to be when when you're implementing the plan. So that sounds like a lot of extra work on the status side, or I mean, maybe this is something basic.
Exactly. So, right.
And then also, say you have a support district and you have an effective date, and for whatever reason that district hasn't done their upload yet. And now they're at next district and they've uploaded. They have an effective date that is going to be the current one. But this district has.
Okay, so there were two questions for those of you on the Zoom. The first one was, sometimes when we're holding meetings, the case managers will enter a plan effective start date into the record that coincides with the meeting date. But what we're saying is, it's really when the parent actually agrees to the plan, and how will SAFE accommodate that? And that's a question for SAFE, okay? Because we know it could be a combination of things. We've articulated the business need to them, and when we go through some of our work, when we're doing our breakouts, you'll see what I'm talking about when we get to the plan and services section. And then the second item, tell me what the second item was again.
So you have a student and you have your plan.
Okay. So I've got a student at my district and I've got a plan effective start date. I have not, or SAFE hasn't, I haven't sent that transaction up to CalPADS. They transfer out of the district. The other district is going to upload their IEP, and they're very likely going to adopt whatever was there prior, and maybe your record isn't in CalPADS yet. Is that going to cause issues and errors? Yeah, it is. It's going to cause problems. Okay, so you have to be mindful. That's why I'm telling you, you need to send your transactions up weekly. Okay, because if you don't, things like that are going to happen. You're going to cause issues where another LEA adopts a prior IEP and it wasn't the most current one. Okay, so you're going to need to have to start doing this on a weekly basis in order for you guys to have the most accurate information, especially because you guys don't always get Q files when the student comes, or a parent doesn't immediately disclose students on an IEP. All right, so changes in the new system. So those of you that are CalPADS admins, you guys know about online maintenance, right? You know that you can go directly into CalPADS and you can add records and you can edit records. That side, you guys have never been able to do that. And that's primarily because we want, the IEP is a legal document, right? And we want the information to come directly from SAFE up to CalPADS. And we want you to have to make the changes in SAFE and send them up. But over the last 3 years, we've heard lots of grumbling because when you guys are in the 11th hour right before certification, and let's say the change that you've made in the IEP system is something that SAFE is going to have to assist with, and so you have to put in a ticket with SAFE, and it's going to take them a while to get through that ticket. We've now made this functionality available to you, which, yes, right, everybody's like really concerned about this. Yes.
I'm really concerned. I mean, have you considered only turning it on in 11-hour window of time rather than all the time? Because I have.
Okay, so we're hearing concerns for those of you on Zoom, concerns about allowing the ability to just go ahead and add records or delete records. First of all, you already have the capability to delete records from SAFE. or not from states, from CALPADS. Now, so we haven't discussed turning it on and off. Either it's on or it's off. Okay, here is the key. So you're on the SIS side, yes?
Both.
Okay, you're on both. Because we did get this concern raised from another SELPA. They said, are you kidding me? Because but this is what they said. They said, I have CALPADS administrators that will go in and add records because they want to get their submissions certified. And they're not the ones who manage the IEP system. They're not in states. They're not inside. So they have no right to put a record in there because this is a legal document. And I totally 100% agree. Okay, so SELPAs, SPED data coordinators, special education directors should be making sure that CALPADS administrators do not have those edit rules. They should never have edit rules for SPED and SSRV. Okay, we're keeping those same rules. Yes, unless they're authorized users. Unless they're authorized users. Go ahead, Sherry.
That's an extremely big task.
We're
CDE.
yes, right. So can CDE share say, like, really you gonna put that on us, CDE? We're actually gonna send out some communication. Okay, so CALPADS administrators, unless they are authorized users and are authorized to submit transactions for special education, should not have the SPED edit and SSRV edit. So you would be an authorized user because you actually work in both systems. But if that CALPADS administrator does not work in SACE or CYRUS, they should not have those edit rules. They shouldn't, right? Specifically because these are legal documents. It's very, very different than information that's in the student information. Okay, so we are going to be putting out some communication about it. So, but you know, you have to, and where you see this is happening, you need to tell it. You should tell it that it's happening because we can address it at the state level. All right, so having said that, we actually just prefer that you send it up from SACE. And maybe you make that local decision. Like, nope, we're not giving anybody these roles because you have to have the roles in order to do it. Okay, so if you decide as a district that you do not want to do this, don't give anybody those roles. Okay, the SCNR, or not SCNR, but SPED and SSRV edit, because those will apply to all the new file types. All right, so what is actually changing in SACE for your case managers or for your SPED data coordinators? And the answer is not a lot. Very, very, very minimal changes. Okay, so when you're holding an IEP, you're putting data in all the same fields. If a kid is not eligible, then you're selecting plan type 900. They're not going to see any changes. The difference is in the output. Okay, the difference is that now you're populating things in SACE, and when SACE generates the files, it's going to be in all different files. So you're really going to need to work closely with SACE, and they've heard this message. They're going to have to tell you, this field in CALPADS now maps to these fields in SACE. And when you do this and you populate these data, this is what it's going to look like in CALPADS. So that's what they're going to cover in their training. Okay? So there are some changes that we made, and you may have seen it. SACE implemented these about a year ago. So the first is student degree of support, and I talked about it a little earlier. Student degree of support is not something that CDE wanted to collect. It's something that we were asked to collect by the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. So has anybody heard of the California State Assignment Accountability System? Okay, so basically it's CALPADS, right?
I love that.
Right, but it just works better when the Bears do. Okay. Anyway, so CALPADS is where the Commission on Teacher Credentialing takes data, or we send them data from CALPADS, that's staff assignment data and course data, like what courses are teachers teaching and what student body is made up in those courses. And we send it over to CTC, and then CTC looks at the course data and the student enrollment and says, does this teacher have the appropriate credential and authorizations to teach this course? That's what CALPADS does. Okay, so what we're talking about here is the need to find out information about students with disabilities that are being taught by teachers in special education settings. So special education setting, what I mean by that is the teacher is teaching a classroom, either self-contained or departmentalized, where all the kids in the class are students with disabilities. And the content was specifically designed for students with disabilities. Okay, so where teachers are teaching in special education settings, they're going to evaluate the primary and secondary disabilities of those students. And now, based on information we're going to collect, not this year, but next year, is the degree of support that student needs for each of those disabilities. Okay, so in my daughter's example, her primary disability was orthopedic impairment, right? But she also had intellectual disability as a secondary disability. So for each of those disabilities, I would have to say Ariana needs mild, moderate support for her orthopedic impairment. And she needs mild, moderate for her intellectual, right? So we would look at, the CTC would look at that and say, does this teacher have an ed specialist credential? And does that teacher either have the mild, moderate authorization or one of the legacy authorizations that allows her to teach my daughter with a mild, moderate disease? Okay, so that link at the bottom is the special education credential authorization, right? It's an authorization chart. And that's exactly what CTC is using to figure out whether or not teachers are appropriately assigned. So that's in the meeting materials link. Okay, that's the SPED authorization chart. So if you have questions about that and whether or not your teachers would be appropriately authorized, that's what they're using. Now, when I talked about this at State SELPA for the very first time, everybody was like, what? No, why are you collecting this? This is HR's job. It's not our job to figure out whether or not the teacher is appropriately assigned. And you know what? You are right. It is HR's job. But my question to you is, whose job is it to figure out what the need of the student is? What is the student's support need? Do you really want HR figuring that out? No. Okay, but we don't have all the answers, right? We can't tell you definitively who should be making this identification, what are the criteria that you're looking at maybe in the IEP document that would make a student extensive support needs or mild moderate. So we're putting together a group, or we put together a group of SELPA reps, and we're actually developing guidance for you. We're letting them lead the way. In those IEP systems, what are some of the indications that the student probably would need extensive support? Okay, and we're having those discussions, not only who should be making the determination, but also where should this piece of information live? Right now, it is in SPACE, and it's in the student data section. They've all agreed that it should never be in the IEP document, okay? But they're also advocating that it be put in the student information system, that it lives in areas for PowerSchool, okay? I personally don't agree with that, because who's going to have to keep it updated? It's going to be the Fed staff, right? So anyway, those are discussions we're having. We will have a draft for you available in January. The requirement to collect this is optional this year. You don't have to submit anything. Next year, it will become required, and we're developing the guidance. Now, the other thing that we initially the other change that we made was parent guardian plan approval type. Okay, the parent guardian plan approval type was in SACE, you saw that as full approval, partial approval, or no approval. Okay, there were these radio buttons. And what we heard from SELPA and from your vendors was it was causing a lot of confusion, because you guys didn't know what partial approval meant. What does that mean, right? And so what they asked was, well, what is DD actually using? And we said, we're using the plan records when the parent has agreed to something. And they said, okay, well, do you really need to collect this? And we said, no, you know what, you're right, we don't. Because really, we only want a record assuming that your system understand that you're not gonna send that plan record until the parent agrees to something. And so they all said, yes, so we're not collecting it, but your vendors are still going to have to collect this in some form locally in order to be able to send it to us only when the parent has agreed. Okay, so SACE is working that out. That's kind of what I was referring to earlier. They're working out how to generate that plan record when it does not coincide with the meeting date. All right, and there are also some necessary local process changes that are going to have to take place. So in SACE, they use a term called affirming. So what do your case managers think that means when they affirm something? Yeah, it better be perfect. And it's usually that it's done. We're done. Okay, but I can tell you, and some of the other SPED systems use different terminology, but that affirm basically means saving the record. That's all it means. Okay, so what it's going to take is retraining your case managers to follow SACE's methodology of how they're going to get meetings up there independent of the plan. Okay, so however SACE chooses to implement that, you are going to have to get your case managers to get into that mindset where if the parent hasn't agreed to something, you don't have to get a plan record up there right away. You don't. You do have to get the meeting information up there to let us know that you held the meeting. The other thing that they are going to need to get in the habit of doing is being proactive in telling the department why meetings are late. Okay, so if you haven't held an initial, if you haven't held an annual or a triennial, you now have the ability to send up a meeting record with a pending as of date to tell us the meeting delay code. Why has this meeting been delayed? Okay, so SACE does have the functionality to do this for initial evaluation. Okay, they have the ability to go in and put in a meeting delay code, and that will generate a transaction to CALPADS to say, this is why our initial is late. They do not currently have functionality to automatically send up pending records for annuals and triennials, but as I told you, you guys, yes.
So, are the delay codes going to and I'm not making this
No. Okay, remember, it's a meeting delay. In this case, it's not parent thinking, it's the meeting hasn't happened. Okay, so it's different. So again, this is what I'm talking about. So, but you know what? This is a perfect example of the fact that meetings and plans are in your minds and in your case manager's mind tied together. Okay, so in this case, the meeting hasn't occurred yet. The parent isn't thinking about anything because you haven't even met yet. In this case, you're just sending up the meeting delay code. There was a school emergency or parent didn't make the child available, etc. So no, we're not going to add additional delay codes. The ones that are there will stay. So, but you can be proactive and say, okay, FMTA team, don't call Sherry and ask why these meetings haven't been held or ask for justification because I've already told you based on this meeting delay code. Okay, so for annuals and triennials in SACE, you can't push it through the API. You can't push it electronically through SACE. You can log into CALPADS and you can add a pending record and tell us why that annual or triennial has not yet been held. Okay, so you will have the ability to do that.
And when you, you mean your state, or are you talking about me going to online maintenance?
Online maintenance.
Oh,
and it my data go on every time.
So you don't have to, but the alternative is that Sherry gets a phone call from the FMTA team asking why you haven't held the meeting.
I don't want a bunch of screening.
Okay, so
But
this
this
is,
is patient too. I'm sure SACE will get something at some point, but right now.
it's not going to happen this year, I can tell
It's
you.
not gonna
Yeah.
happen this year. Okay.
So, you know, again, you guys, the alternative is status quo. Status quo is you don't send up the meeting delay code until you hold the meeting. But in the meantime, when they're pulling those data every month, that kid is going to look late and they're going to want justification and they're asking for a 20% reduction every single month. Okay, so as long as if you don't send up the yes, go ahead.
So are they still pulling and speaking data over to the
for 20 days or are they going? Once a student plays one day, they're populating on.
Right, so Sherry's saying,
Grace period.
what's the metric that they're using to determine whether or not the student's late? And Joe, do you know what the metric is that they're using for the monitoring reports that they're pulling? Is it just one day as of the current date that you're pulling it?
I have to clarify that again, Brandy. My understanding is yes, yeah.
So it's as of, it's one day late. So I did have a suggestion from East County SELPA yesterday, was that, and we'll take it back and we'll talk to the monitoring team about this, but one of the things that she said was, you know, one of the things that CDE needs to realize is that we can go ahead and we can hold a meeting and we can get that transaction generated, but it takes some time for that information to actually get up to CALPADS. So when they're running those monitoring reports, what would be helpful is if they didn't look for IEPs that were late as of that date, but maybe 7 days prior. Maybe you're looking at, if today's date is August 30th, I'm really looking at IEPs that were late as of the 23rd, because then that gives a padding to get the record up there and to get the transaction generated and somebody sending it up.
Special communication about that. Days overdue.
Okay.
Up with it.
Got it.
But a good way to think about it is make sure you're using that monitoring report at a certain particular snapshot time during a month. And then if you have kids that are on there, go into the online maintenance system and get
Pending record.
out there.
So Sharon's just saying that initial communication from CDE was that they were only going to generate those monitoring reports for kids that were at least 120 days late. But apparently that changed. But a good strategy is to actually look at your monitoring report, see the kids that are showing up late, and for those kids, go into CALPADS, enter the meeting delay codes directly into online maintenance with the pending FSA. Yes.
Do you know in CalPADS when we go in and enter that, or is the option to do a 20 and a 40, or will we create a 20 and then create it again for a 40?
Okay, that's a great question. So in CalPADS, if we're submitting a meeting delay and it's the annual and triennial on the same day, are we going to be able to use delay codes that are applicable to a triennial but not the annual? And we talked to our company teams and they said yes. Yes, you can. Okay. So it is 10:10. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break because we're running a little. You guys are having lots of questions, which is good. So let's take a 10-minute break. Come back at 10:20. Yes, ma'am. Okay, in the interest of time, let's go ahead and get started because I want to get you guys out of here on time. So we talked about the meeting delay code and just we had a question in the Zoom or a comment rather that says, you know, having to send up all these meeting delay codes, that's going to be a nightmare. You know, if we're already taxed for time, and I get it, folks. Remember, it's not mandatory. You don't have to do it. You don't have to send up records with meeting delay codes telling us the meeting is pending. You don't have to, but it's going to assist CDE in understanding why those meetings haven't been held, and the only ones that you're going to be on the hook for are those that don't have justifiable reason, which means there's no meeting delay code in there, or it's late without cause. Okay, so those are the only ones. Now, the last thing that your process change that you're going to have to think about again this year, when we provide you that guidance, is how you're going to populate those student degrees of support. But you don't need to worry about that right now until we provide you some guidance. Okay, so in terms of starting with a baseline of records, okay, so when you start submitting these files on the 19th, the only way that a lot of the validations and things are going to work is if we have a baseline set of records already created for you. So how in the heck are we going to do that? So we're using existing FED and SSRV records that are in the system. And for most of you, it's going to be records that were effective as of June 30th, 2023. We're going to take those existing records, and our partners over at California School Information Services developed a really complicated query and a set of logic that basically analyzes all of those records for students based on the most recent information, and it's creating a status record, it's creating meeting records for their most recent meeting, and for those students who will actually have plans and services, it's going to create those plans and services for you from the prior year data. Okay, we're not converting all of the records. We're only converting the most recent for students who recently exited, are pending meetings, or were expected to return next year. Okay, so that's the only set of data that we're collecting, because now those validations are really only going to, we only want it to trigger on the most recent information. Okay, so we will have that. The key here is that sometimes, in fact, we're doing some analysis on these data right now, and we're finding that some of the records are not generating correctly because you guys made errors in the dates in some of those records, because we're analyzing those records. So because there are errors in those dates, the logic does not generate the correct records. So you're going to need to verify it, is my point. Okay, so when we go live, there's going to be some students that might be eligible and participating, but they don't have an eligible and participating status. Okay, so you don't have to go back and modify prior year transactions and send those up. You could potentially use online maintenance to do that. Okay, use it with discretion, obviously, but we're going to give you some strategies over the next month. I'm going to work with my team and CSIS to try and help you figure out strategies where you can reconcile those records that we created with you for you with the data that you haven't saved. Okay. All right. This next part, I'm sorry, is really dry, but it is very important for you to understand the relationships between all these new files, because before it was two, right? It was reporting LEA, SSID, and SELPA, right? That's what connected those SSRV and SPED records. Now it's a lot more complicated because we have 4 files. Okay, so you need to understand the dependencies between these files, because if you have one in there and not the other, or the criteria of one of those files is not accurate, what's going to happen to you guys? Errors, right? It results in errors. So it's important that you understand the dependencies between these. Okay, so first and foremost, let's talk about relationships between the enrollment record and some of these file types. Okay, so in terms of enrollment, Who creates enrollments for students with disabilities in your district? Who creates the enrollment records?
The registrar or office manager.
Office manager, or it's probably your CALPADS or SIS administrator, right? So it's that person who's creating those enrollment records. So there are some instances where you're always going to need an enrollment record. One example, and it's not up here, I'm sorry, is for initial evaluation. In order to even send up any type of SPED record from PACE, you have to have an SSID. The only way to get an SSID is if your CALPADS administrator or your SIS administrator actually creates it for you. Okay, so for kids who need to be initially assessed and have parental consent for evaluation, they need to create an enrollment. Okay, but the other thing is that that enrollment actually has to be there anytime for the very first time that you're submitting up an SWDS record, a students with disability status. So if you're submitting up a status telling us that student is eligible and participating, you have to have a corresponding enrollment. And what I mean by corresponding enrollment is that this status start date falls somewhere between the enrollment start date and the enrollment exit date. Okay, so we're looking for that correlation. And in the case where you're initially sending up an eligible and participating record, then the LEA has to be the same. You have to have an enrollment. Okay. When you're submitting subsequent statuses, and we're looking at status of eligible and participating, keep in mind that we only expect to see one eligible and participating record in there for the student through the entire duration of their participation in special. Typically, okay? So they're only going to be eligible and participating, and there's going to be one LEA that established that. If they exit special education and re-enter, then you could potentially see a second record. Yes. No, it's okay.
You know, questions are preschoolers that aren't really involved in the first evaluation or currently in a private school. And so previously, only they take time to see, but they now, because it's a required field, when you're creating that record to get that AP, you don't have the portable method to get that AP. So I'm just going to figure out how those two are supposed to.
Okay, so I think what I heard is for preschoolers and parentally placed private school students, how do you create the enrollment when you don't have a signed assessment plan yet? Okay, so the bottom line is you can generate the SSID, but really you shouldn't be doing that until you receive parental consent for evaluation. Okay, so are you saying that SACE requires the SSID before you put in the parental consent for evaluation?
Enrollment
It's not portable yet. So there's, I just
An
feel like
enrollment
confusion
date. SACE is requiring an enrollment date.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can talk to them about that. Because if they don't actually have an enrollment, but here's what I will tell you is that in those cases, the enrollment date will always coincide with the assessment date or the parental consent for evaluation. Sorry. So if you train that way and say the enrollment date that you're entering needs to be the parental consent for evaluation date in these cases for parentally placed in private schools or for preschool that aren't actually attending.
And then first that would be for students, but then the family, for whatever reason, isn't providing that food. And so you're still required to report the student. This side, we're getting hung up on
Demographic.
documentation that's required for enrollment, and the enrollment files really just report outcomes.
Right. Okay. So here's what I've advocated since we started doing this transition. So what Sherry said was sometimes we get hung up on the SPED side because we don't have all of the demographic needed to put into the student information system to create not only the enrollment record, but also the demographic, the SINF record, student information record. So what we've advocated for a really long time is for districts to standardize their enrollment process, which means that in order to be assessed for special education, they fill out the same enrollment form as they do when they're enrolling in school. The same. So if you haven't done that, that's why that's happening, right? So you have to standardize that process because now it's one single source for the student record, which is in this case, the SSID is obtained through the student information system. So you have to have consistent collection of data on all those students.
Like kind of decides that it's time to aid.
Right.
On the hook for that evaluation, but for whatever reason, it hasn't put in that registration fee. So what are the requirements?
Right. So, so what are the requirements when they haven't filled out the enrollment forms, but they've signed the assessment plan? And the answer to that is, in order to get an SSID, there's very few data elements that you actually need, right? And I can't off the top of my head tell you exactly what they are, but it's minimal. Eventually, you're going to have to follow it up with the other information. But I can get back to you. And if you look in the CALPADS file specification, if you look in that document and you look in the student enrollment file layout, it tells you exactly which fields are required to create an SSID, right? It tells you, it'll say required in that column. Okay, yes.
Sorry there. But if we have a 3-year-old who needs speech, and so we enroll them in our SIS in a non-ADA class. So is that going to be wrong now because that record has to connect, has to be reported through
So
CALPADS, right?
can we still report 3-year-olds? So a 3, which is preschool, right? They're preschool age. And are we going to need an enrollment for that preschooler? They're not going to school. They're just receiving services.
Correct.
Yeah, you're going to create a primary enrollment for that student. Yeah, you always, preschool age and up is always primary, always. With the exception of parental placed in private school, if they're school age, then those are enrollment kind of students. Right, but preschool age kids are always primary. Doesn't matter if they're in private school or not.
We always have a group, not just 1 or 2, but a group of, we get the signed assessment plan back, but we can never get the parent to complete the enrollment paperwork.
Right, which is what
And
Sharon
then-
was just
yeah.
saying. Yeah.
So
So how do we handle parents who sign the assessment plan but never complete the enrollment paperwork? All I can tell you is you're going to have to be diligent about trying to get it back because you're going to need it. You're going to need all of that information in order for your reports to generate correct. If you don't have all the demographic criteria, then some of those kids are not going to show up on these reports.
because we can't stop the 60-day timeline.
No, and you
That's
shouldn't.
whatnot,
You shouldn't. You
because-
need to assess them. You shouldn't stop those 60-day timelines, but you need to be diligent about trying to get back the rest of that information.
We're talking weekly. We're talking when they come in with the kid because they did qualify, and the office manager says, hey, this needs to be filled out. You've got to fill it out before you leave.
And there are all
And
these,
you're
there's
not
all
filling
these
it out,
corner cases. All I can tell you is just keep trying. I mean, that's because again, those kids are not going to show up on the reports unless you have a full demographic profile.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So, again, for eligible and participating statuses, you need an overlapping enrollment plan. Okay, if you're setting up a plan and the reporting LEA, from your reporting LEA, we're assuming that that kid is actually actively receiving services. Okay, so it's looking for reporting LEA here, and it's looking for the same SSID, but here's the key. Effective start date has to fall somewhere between the enrollment start and ending. Okay, the plan effective date has to fall somewhere in between. Okay, here we go. Meeting and statuses. So this is for initials. Okay, so once you hold an initial meeting, something happens. Okay, parent doesn't always sign or approve the IEP, but something happens. Yes.
I'm sorry, I get the DT with that coding, but what is
Oh, I'm
BS?
sorry. Sorry. I got the same question yesterday. So that column is the format, character string or data string field. Sorry about that. It's a relic from some slides that I copied this into. Okay. So for meetings, after you hold an initial, something happens. Either the student is eligible or they are not eligible. Okay. So if you're sending us up a meeting record and you're telling us an initial evaluation has occurred, we expect a subsequent status, even if the parent hasn't signed. Okay, so if I have status codes of eligible and participating, eligible not participating, eligible not enrolled, and not eligible, and the student has been determined to be eligible, but the parent just hasn't signed, what is the status I expect to come up? Based on what I just told you. Eligible not participating. Okay, so during the period of time that that parent is mulling over and has not signed the plan, they will be eligible not participating once the parent agrees to the plan and the IEP team comes to some consensus, then that should generate another transaction of eligible and participating. Okay, so
And
how will that happen in SACE?
How, what's the mechanism?
And that is SACE question. That's a SACE question.
So it will theoretically be in the state.
Yes, but no, it will.
But that would theoretically then require.
What will generate that record? What will generate that record? Okay, so let me ask you this question. You have to step back and think about what happens when you don't have agreement after an initial, and you don't have parent agreement, the parent hasn't agreed to anything. Okay, typically you guys will affirm and hit no approval, or you don't affirm, you just leave it open. Okay, so it stays open. Okay, now again, in order to show a meeting has occurred, you're going to have to affirm something. Okay. Now, that's probably some of these changes that SACE is making. So let's just assume your local process is immediately after that initial is held, you affirm that meeting, okay? And what goes up is the meeting record. Then, subsequently, 3 weeks later, the parent signs. How would you, just process-wise, go into SACE and identify that the parent has signed? What does that look like?
Button from time.
There you go. Okay. So once you do that, potentially, and I'm not saying that this is exactly how it's going to work, I'm just saying potentially, based on that activity, then SACE would send up not only the plan, but a subsequent status that says now they're eligible and participating. Okay. But these are questions that you need to ask SACE because this is our expectation. Yes.
So then what would the plan start date that we finally got that?
What would the plan effective start date be? So based on everything that you're hearing, what does it sound like it would be?
The date you receive the signature?
Yes, the date the parent signs the IEP, or in some cases, let's say you're doing an assessment plan for a kid who's going to start kindergarten in the fall. What's the plan effective start date? First day of school. There we go. Okay, so it's going to change. That so just pause there because we're gonna go through some of these activities. Okay. Status and plan. You guys are asking really good questions, so I really appreciate it. Status and plan. So students who are enrolled on census day, this is really key, the first Wednesday in October. Okay, that's our first census day, point in time. So if they're enrolled on census day and they have a status of eligible and participating, okay, it does not have to be from your district. That's key because it may have been established years ago in another district. But if that student is enrolled in your district and they have a status of eligible and participating, then it means you have to have a plan in there for that student. Whether you're adopting the plan or you're creating an amendment of a plan or you have an annual plan review. Okay, you have to have, and here's the key, the plan effective start date and the status start date have to be aligned. So this plan effective start date has to be on or after the status start date of eligible and participating. Okay, so there is some dependency between status and plan. You will always have to have a plan, overlapping plan, if they're eligible and participating. Plan and services, the link between these, again, is that plan effective start date, but we're also looking for the same SSID, the same reporting LEA, and SELPA, okay? Because that is a plan that is unique to your district, SELPA. All right, so we're gonna go into the activities, and I just need to prep you because I'm gonna give you some of the answers in what I'm about to tell you. So, what is the special education status file? That is the state of students' eligibility and participation in special education. And we've got 4 options, right? And we just talked about them. Eligible and participating, which means I'm eligible and I'm actively receiving services. Eligible and not participating, which means I'm eligible, but for whatever reason, I am not currently participating, okay? And we'll get to those non-participation codes in just a second. Eligible and not enrolled, this is new, okay? This, typically if they're not enrolled and there's no school enrollment, where are school exits captured in your district? Student information system, there are areas. Did the student pass away? Did the student drop out? Did the student graduate? Did they have some other form of high school completion? Did they transfer out of the country? Did they transfer out of the state? Okay, all of those are captured in the SIS. But now it's going to be important that you coordinate with your SIS coordinator when any of those types of exits occur, because what we expect is a status of eligible and not enrolled. Okay, so that status of eligible and not enrolled tells us we know that they're no longer enrolled. If you don't have that, and we see that the student is eligible and participating, but they don't have a corresponding enrollment at your district, you're going to get an error that says, hey, this student has an active SPED plan, they're eligible and participating, but there's no enrollment. So we expect a status of eligible and not enrolled. Yes.
So these errors that you keep talking about,
Mhm.
are they gonna just show up when we're trying to certify like fall one
That's a great
or
question.
into year
So
four?
are we only going to see error when we're trying to certify? This next year is changing because now we're adding something called data discrepancies. The answer is no. Okay, you're going to be able to see these errors all year long. Okay, and you'll know if it's going to affect your fall one certification. You'll know if it's going to affect end of year certification because it will show you. You can handle these errors all year long.
So then we don't have to wait
For
for the CalPADS to open up the window for that validation.
That is correct.
Like
We don't
last
have to
year.
wait. So September 19th
Wonderful.
is when all this stuff goes into production. And I believe the data discrepancy reports will be available at that time as well. Okay, so you can start looking at these things before information day. Okay, and get them cleaned up before information day. CalPADS folks, technical team, please don't make a liar of me. Make sure the data discrepancy reports are finished. So with number 3, you have to coordinate. Number 4, not eligible, either after initial evaluation for part C or part B, or the student exits special education, they're no longer eligible. Okay. Now, again, the status is attached to the student. So what I mean by that is, you don't have to submit up a new status just because the kid changes schools. Okay, you only submit up a new status when that kid's status actually changes to something else. So they go from eligible and participating to one of the other statuses, or from one of the other statuses to eligible and participating. Okay. Non-participation reason codes, you guys know these as plan type 700, 800, 900, and then your exit codes, your special education exit codes. But there are a few new ones. Yes.
I'm just curious, because so we have Census Day, first Wednesday in October.
Yes.
Usually we have a little bit of time before fall one closes, but we're learning a whole new process and having to do all of these. It's gonna be nice. A little bit more window of time.
So Census Day is going to be Census Day, right? You don't actually have to certify these data until December.
Yeah.
And so you're asking, is TDE going to extend our deadline in December, that initial certification deadline? The answer is probably not. Okay, but here's the thing, folks. This is a new process, but all of the heavy lifting is on the vendor side, right? They're the ones that are generating these new files. You guys are submitting the transaction. Really, it's going to come down to learning how to figure out error resolution. And that error resolution is really going to rely on your vendors communicating exactly where these data live in your IEPs. Okay, so that piece and error resolution is really going to fall on states and how well effectively they communicate. So I want to call your attention to codes 25, 26, and 31 because those are brand new. So 25, exited SPED out of state. What do you think that means?
They left the state, they left the special ed in that state.
There you go. That's the answer. Okay. So when we've been doing these, people think that it means when they leave out of state, they use this code. And that's because the name is bad, right? We developed this name, we thought it was clear, and it's not. So you only use this when a student was in California, was on an active IEP, leaves the state, then that state exits them from special education, and then they come back to California. So you have to have a way to tell CalPADS, I didn't exit them, the other state exited them, but as of the date they returned to my school, they are not eligible. There would be a status of not eligible, and the reason would be they were exited from special education out of state. Yes,
When that happens, and they exit that, they say that they get the child reevaluated.
can they reevaluate a student who has been exited from special education in the other state? And the answer is yes. Okay, but if they've been exited from another state, you would still have to do this process, right? They were exited, they're not eligible because they were exited out of state, and then you can submit another initial evaluation.
So somehow we have statements to help us generate that, so that we can upload it.
Yeah, so SACE is gonna have to assist in helping you guys generate transactions to say, this kid came back, they were exited out of state. And again, SACE is gonna have to show you exactly how to do that. All right, the next one is 26. So the IFSP team determined no Part B evaluation is needed. So if a child who's getting ready to turn 3 is meeting age-appropriate goals, and as a team, you guys have decided that you don't have to evaluate them for Part B, right? There's no Part B evaluation necessary, and the parent agrees. Then you would use this code, because using this code means that CALPADS doesn't expect a Part B evaluation by their 3rd birthday. So you won't get those late notifications, okay? If you use anything else, we're gonna expect an evaluation by their 3rd birthday. Okay? And then the last one is left school and not expected to return. So this gets used in conjunction with those eligible, not enrolled statuses. They're eligible, they're not enrolled, but in this case, they left school and we don't expect them to come back, okay? Again, that requires collaboration with your SIS coordinator, because they're the ones that are populating those types of exits, transfers out of state, transfers out of the country, dropout, graduates, completers, yes.
So are they still gonna be able to retain their eligibility because they don't need to, and they just wanna break and leave?
So are they gonna be able to retain eligibility, and come back for transition services? Because, or they wanna break and leave, that, we're gonna talk about that right now. You guys are gonna talk about it actually. Okay, so in this scenario, these are the instances in which we expect an SWDS record to come up. And again, you're not generating that record. SACE is. But what I'm telling you is what we expect. So if SACE is not doing it correctly, based on this expectation, you'll be able to go back to your vendor and say, well, this is what CDE said, but you guys aren't generating this record in this particular scenario. Okay, so anytime you have an initial evaluation, okay, we're expecting SWDS record when they're eligible and the parent signs the plan. They're eligible, but the parent hasn't signed the plan. When they're eligible and the parent declines services. When they're eligible, but services won't begin until the fall, or if they're ineligible. So all of those scenarios, we expect a record. We also expect a record from eligible students, so students who are already on active plans. If they exit special education for any reason, if they graduate or pass away, they drop out or leave the state, or they return to California after being exited from special education in another state. Okay, but we don't expect one when the student remains eligible and their status has not changed. Okay, we don't expect that. So if there's a handout on your table, so the objective here is to ask one person to just record the answers in each of, so you're looking at SWDS scenario number 1. For each of them, yes or no answer. Do we expect the record or not? Okay. So let's take 3 minutes to do this. 3 minutes.
because we have to report that they state we're no longer eligible.
We've not got through all of these. We wanted to go ahead and we want to get you out of here on time. Okay, so we're going to go through all of these together. Okay. All right. Okay. So for the first scenario, which is student is newly evaluated for Part B and was found ineligible, do we expect a record?
Yes.
Yes, we absolutely do, right? We want a status record. Where in the heck, does anybody see where I set down the slide advancer? Oh, here it is. Okay, there we go. Okay, for the next scenario, student was on Part C, was evaluated for Part B and determined to be eligible. Do we expect a status record?
Yes.
Why? Okay, let me ask you a question. In this case, has the student's status changed?
No.
What changed?
Plan.
There we go. Plan. So what would we expect? A plan. You would expect a new plan, but we don't expect the status of eligible versus failing, because guess what? They already are. Now, if the student was evaluated for Part B and was not eligible, would we expect a status record? Yes. Okay, but in this case, no, because they were eligible. Okay, so remember, status records are only required when there's a change in that student's status. Okay, next, student leaves the state, do we expect a record?
Yes.
Now we do. In the old model, we didn't. We didn't expect a record, but in this one, we do. Student is initially evaluated for Part B, is found eligible, but the parent hasn't signed the IEP. Do we expect a status? Yes, we do. Okay, 5. The parent of a student on an active IEP revokes consent for special education instruction and services. Do we expect a status? Yeah, because it's changed. Okay, 6. Student on an active IEP transfers to a new LEA. Do we expect a record? No, we don't, because their status is the same. Okay, if the student passes the California high school proficiency, yes.
Which is no longer in play, the trust is gone.
So the CHSP is still there. California high school proficiency exam, or are you talking about, there was the high set and then there was another assessment? No, I think the CHSP is still active. Okay, so if I'm wrong, then we can go ahead and change this. But there was the high set and there was another high school equivalency, and I can't remember what it was called. But the California high school proficiency exam is actually something different. The task has gone away. Just be still there.
Are you talking about the one that's kind of like getting, they passed it and got their GED?
No, a GED is a GED. The California high school proficiency exam is separate. Okay, so for those of you that work in the SIS, you know that there are separate exit codes. California high school proficiency exam, high school equivalency, and then GED. Those are all separate exit codes. They're different types of completion. But in this case, let's just assume the student passed the proficiency exam and they exited school. Do we require a status record? Okay. Yes. 8, student is on an IEP, is parentally placed in a private school. The parent elects to have that student served on an ISP. Do we need a status change? Anybody say yes? Okay, you said both. Right, and why don't we need a record? Because they're still eligible. They're just being served on a different plan. Okay, so we would need a plan, but we would not need a new status record. Okay, so in the interest of time, what I want to do is for part 2, I want to go through these and have a discussion. Okay, so part 2, you turn to part 2. These are all of the scenarios in which we just talked about the fact that we would need a status record. So what we're trying to think through here is what would the status be? Okay, and if you look on part 2, you'll see I've added the status codes. Okay, so we've got a list of status codes which are eligible and participating, eligible but not participating, eligible and not enrolled, and then not eligible. And then we've also got the non-participation reason code, which you guys know as your exit reasons or plan type 700, 800, 900. Okay, so for a student who's newly evaluated for Part B and was found ineligible, look through those status codes and tell me what you think the status would be for someone who was found ineligible.
4 and 21.
4, right, okay? Remember, if you've got a status that tells us they're not participating or they're ineligible, you're gonna have to tell us the non-participation reason code. Okay, so 4 would be not eligible, and that's correct. So what would the non-participation reason code be?
21.
Okay, so 21, not eligible, that's right. Okay, so the status is not eligible, the non-participation reason code is because they're not eligible. Okay, and for those of you that downloaded the meeting materials, this roadshow quiz is also, and for those of you on Zoom, I apologize. The roadshow quiz is part of your meeting materials documentation, so if you want to pull that document up in your laptops, that's totally fine. It's called roadshow quizzes. Okay, second, the student leaves the state. So what status would we use?
3.
Okay, what's 3?
Eligible and not.
Eligible and not enrolled. Okay, and what would their non-participation reason code be?
Getting ready.
25.
24.
Okay, so, all right, so this is where we always get hung up. Remember, we talked about 25 and what that means. So 25 is exited, sped out of state, but when do you use that? Remember, it's only when they've been exited out of state. Okay.
They return back.
So in this case, if the student leaves the state, they're eligible and they just leave. They leave California.
Eligible.
It's 31. Because they left school, they're not expected to come back. Okay? So eligible, not enrolled, left school, expected to return. Okay, the next one, 3. Student is initially evaluated for Part B, is found eligible, but the parent hasn't yet signed the IEP. So what do we expect that status to be?
2.
2. Okay, which is eligible, not participating. Now, look through the non-participation reason codes. And
I'm confused on that one. Jenny.
Sure.
I'm so sorry.
on this one,
But if you don't have to on an initial IEP from the parent, they're not eligible. Because if they end up never signing IEP.
you know what, I didn't see. So in this case, eligibility has been determined, and that's the way we were thinking about it. Now, whether or not they're participating is different. Okay, so they're eligible, but they are not participating until, in this case, the parent has signed the IEP. But I understand why
Yeah,
you're
because
saying
usually
that.
we're like after
Right.
70 months.
Okay, so, and we'll take that back and we can probably talk about it, whether it would be not eligible until the parent actually signs after an initial, because that's a really good observation. So in this case, let's just assume the status is 2, eligible, not participating. What would the non-participation reason code be? I heard 12 and I heard 22. So 22 is no consent from C to B, right? That's another place where people get hung up. Okay, so in this case, no consent from Part C to B means that they were never evaluated for Part B because the parent didn't provide consent. Okay, so it would be 12, eligible but no education plan, other reasons. Okay, so this is the status we would expect to come up before a parent has signed this initial. And maybe if we discuss it, it might end up being not eligible, no education plan. But in this case, or that would be not eligible until the parent says, you know, hey, I've signed and I've agreed to something. So we'll take that back and talk about it. All right, so this next one, the parent of a student on an active IEP revokes consent for special education instruction and services. So we would expect the status record. What would the status be? Okay, I heard eligible and not participating, and I heard not eligible. Okay, so why would you say not eligible? Well, because the parents, in this case, the parents revoked consent. They're providing written revocation saying, I don't want services. Okay, this particular data element is problematic, and we figured this out through the course of the last year. Because what we've learned, and you can tell me whether or not this is a scenario that you find in your districts. And we actually talked about one earlier today. We have a parent who was on an IEP at a public school, and they took their student out and they parentally placed them in a private school. And the parent said, I don't want ISP services, but they have not revoked consent for special education services. Okay, so in those situations, how are you guys handling that? Are you submitting a withdrawal code to CALPADS? Okay, here's the problem is currently we're using that withdrawal code for both of those purposes, for explicit revocation and then for voluntary withdrawal without revocation. We're using that same code for those two things, except they're very different. Okay, so if a parent revokes consent for special education, they are not eligible. They're not eligible. Okay, if they don't revoke, but they just want a cessation of service, they're still eligible. They're just not participating. So we talked to our attorneys last week, and our attorneys basically said, we do need to make a distinction between those two things, but it's too late to do it for this year. We're going to have to do it next year. So next year, the answer to this question is going to be different. Okay, but for this year, when you're submitting up these records and the student meets either of those two scenarios, where there's a cessation of service because the parent doesn't want it, but they haven't revoked, or they've revoked, you're gonna send up a status of eligible, not participating with a withdrawal code. 24 withdrawal, okay? So the difference between those two things is that if a parent revokes consent, what do they gotta do to get back in? An initial. But where you don't have that revocation, do they have to do another initial? No, you can do an annual plan review. You might even be able to do a triennial eligibility reevaluation if a long enough period of time has elapsed.
So then what you're saying is if we have this happen a lot, in 8th grade, they go to Cardinal New, which is a private school for high school. The parent just enrolls them there, then we're gonna say eligible, but not receiving service because it's left.
So if that student transfers, and let's just say, if the student transfers to a high school within your same district, okay? Because oftentimes it's remember, the district of location is responsible for reporting students where that private school is located. But let's just say it's in the same district in this case. The student was eligible and participating in an IEP at your school. They transfer to a private high school. The parent says, I don't want ISP service. Okay. You ask them, they don't want ISP services, but they have not revoked consent. Would you send up a subsequent status of eligible, not participating? Yes. With a withdrawal code? Yes. You would do that right now this year. Next year, let's talk about it. Let's say, because what we're going to end up doing is we're eliminating the withdrawal code. We're going to retire it next year. And we're creating two new ones, revocation and then voluntary cessation without revocation. Okay, so we're creating those two different ones. So if they got revocation, right, the parent revoked consent, then your school or the school where the private school is located would send up a status of not eligible, and the reason is revocation. If they just don't want the ISP services, it would be voluntary cessation without revocation. And then, or excuse me, it would be eligible, not participating, voluntary cessation without revocation. Okay. So the scenarios are different next year. This year, this is what you're going to have to do because there isn't any other option here. But we are modifying the definition of withdrawal to include those two specific scenarios. Okay. All right, and then lastly, student passes the California High School Proficiency Exam. They pass and they leave school. What would the status be? 3? Anybody have a different answer? It's eligible and not enrolled. Okay, 2 is eligible and not participating. Okay, why would you say, I see where you're going, but I want you to explain why you would say they're eligible but not participating. Why are they still eligible? Okay, right. So you just say it, but let's talk through the logic. Is a student that passes the high school proficiency exam still eligible for special education? Yeah, why? Because they haven't received the standard high school diploma. Okay? It is not an equivalent. At the federal level, it is not an equivalent. Okay, it's not a standard high school diploma, which means they can come back and they can receive services. So in this case, the student is eligible, not enrolled, but they're not expected to return. So it would be eligible, not enrolled, left school, not expected to return. But let's just say this kid decided, after all, that they want to come back for transition services. If they did, what would their subsequent status be? Eligible and participating, right? If they decided to come back. The only status, or excuse me, the only exit in which they cannot come back and when they will be ineligible is a California standard high school diploma. A standard high school diploma, they cannot come back. Even the new alternate diploma, they can actually come back for transition services. Okay, so a standard high school diploma is the only time where they would be not eligible. Every other type of completer is going to be eligible, not participating if they've left.
So then they would be only able to come back for just transition service.
So would they only be eligible to come back just for transition services? No. As long as they haven't received a high school diploma, folks, they can continue to pursue that high school diploma as long as they want, until they're age 22. Okay, they can. It doesn't mean they can only come back. Okay. All right, moving on to meeting. This one's gonna be pretty easy. As I told you, the only time we want a meeting record is when a statutory meeting has occurred. It resets the clock. The date in that record is gonna reset the clock. The other time, and we talked about it earlier, is when a statutory meeting is pending and it's now late. You can send up or enter in pending as of record and tell us why the meeting is delayed. So those are the only two scenarios in which we expect meeting records to come up. We do not expect meeting records to come up if the IEP team meets to do an amendment. Or if you have those continuance meetings, second, third, fourth meeting. That is not when we expect a meeting record. It's the date that that meeting was initiated, the date that you met your statutory compliance. Okay, so take about 3 minutes, talk in your team, and tell me, in these scenarios, do we expect a meeting record? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, again, maybe you haven't gotten to all of these, but we can walk them together. Okay, so scenario number 1. Student has an initial evaluation, is determined to be eligible, but the parent hasn't yet signed the offer of faith. Do we expect a meeting record?
Yes.
Yes, we do in that scenario. Yes. Okay. A meeting is held to amend the student's IEP. Do we expect a meeting record?
No.
Okay, why don't we? Because it's not the statutory, it doesn't reset the statutory clock. Amendments don't do that. Only those actual meetings.
We might have to send up an SCRV file.
We might have to send up an SERV file, a service file, or a new plan record. If that's perfect observation. So for those of you on Zoom, and just FYI, what I'm trying to do in lieu of handing a microphone to the participants to ask their questions, I'm repeating what they say, and then I'm sort of giving commentary after that. So yes, the answer to that question is, for amendments, we expect new plan records with new plan effective dates and associated services with the same effective start date, plan effective start date. Okay, number 3, student has a triennial eligibility reevaluation. It's found to be ineligible. Do we expect a meeting record?
Yes.
Yeah, because the triennial has been held. An annual plan review meeting was held and the record was sent to CALPADS. Okay, this one was a little confusing, so sorry about this. So in this case, you held the annual. That record went up to CALPADS already, but then the parent hasn't yet agreed, so you're having those continuance meetings. So do you need to send up the continuance meetings?
No.
No, it's that very first date that you met your statutory compliance. Okay, 5, a meeting is held. It's not an annual or triennial where the student's parent revokes consent for special education. So do we need a meeting record?
No.
Yes. Okay, why do we need a meeting record? Ah, what did you just say? Say it again.
Status.
Their status changed, so we would need a status record, but we would not even need a meeting record, okay? So in this case, they didn't exit in a triennial, they didn't exit as part of the annual, but if they did, let's just say they did a triennial and they exited in the triennial, would we send up a meeting record?
Yes, because of the monitoring committee and the deadline of holding that.
Right,
eval.
right. Because yes, we would send it up because I have a statutory compliance. I have to meet my compliance requirements, which is that I hold that triennial on time. In this case, the kid is not eligible. So what would I also need?
An exit.
Which comes in which record? Status. I would need a status record. So if they're exited during one of the statutory meetings, I'm going to need a meeting and I'm going to need a status record. Okay, great. 6, annual plan review was scheduled. It's pending. It's now overdue. Do I expect a meeting record? Yeah, I do. Because now I can tell you that the meeting is pending and here's why with the meeting delay code. Okay, and again, for SACE users, you can do this on initials and send those through the API. But for annuals and triennials, you're going to have to manually enter those into CALPADS if you want that information to be available for your monitoring consultant. Okay, last, triennial eligibility reevaluation and annual plan review are held on the same date, but the IEP team has not yet reached consensus on the student's plan. So they're held on the same date. Do we need a record?
Yes.
Okay, how many records do we need?
2.
Okay, why do we need 2?
Well, you've got the eligibility portion, which is your triennial or your
Yeah, you've
eligibility.
got to try,
And then you have your plan review, which
and
is
you have
the
your annual.
And
Okay,
you want to say to the monitoring people,
we
I
met
held both of them.
Okay, and you know what? That's how we make you do it right now. We make you send in 2 records for a meeting that was held on the same day. And guess what? You don't have to do that anymore.
Wonderful.
One record. It's 1 record with 1 meeting date. In that record, you can tell us that both of those activities occurred. One is called the evaluation type code, and it would say eligibility reevaluation. And then there's another column that says plan review, yes or no. Okay, so if both of those things occurred, you would see eligibility reevaluation, plan review, yes.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is anytime the monitoring committee or the status thing needs to be reported, we're going to have a meeting notice that is reported to. But if it's an additional meeting where the parent wants to check the status of the kid, we don't have to worry about reporting that. It's only the statutory meetings. 'cause they
Yeah,
have to report.
So what you're saying, for those of you on Zoom, she's saying, what you're saying is the only time we actually have to report a meeting record is when we're meeting our statutory requirement for meetings. Yes, that's the answer to that question. Okay, you don't have to report every single meeting you have with parents. Okay, it's only, but my question is, can parents request plan reviews more often than once a year?
Yeah.
Okay, and when they do, that will reset the clock. Okay, so even if they request them more than once annually, if they're doing a plan review, then that resets the clock.
So then if we held one in September and they called one in December, their IEP year now comes December for the next year when the next meeting is due.
That's correct, because it will reset the clock. So if we have an IEP meeting in September and the parent wants another IEP plan review in December, then December now becomes the date that drives that 365-day requirement. Okay, and we're going to use this meeting record for that. Okay, so yes. Now, when we get to part 2 of this, what I want you to think about is the meeting date. And these are pretty easy. So I want you to just talk about it. When we get to number 3, that's when it becomes hard. Okay, so.
Brandy, just to interrupt, we have a question here in regards to amendment that changed services. That is also kind of consequential to what you said, right? Because we don't need it for statutory requirements, so we're not collecting amendments that are changing services. That needs a meeting record.
So if you have amendments, any type of amendment in CALPADS will not require a meeting record, but it will require a new plan record. Okay, if you are amending some of the state reportable fields, we're going to require a new plan record and the associated services. If you're changing the services, then we're going to require a new plan record with a new plan effective date and the associated services. But amendments will not require meeting record. Does that answer the question, Joe?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay, no problem. All right, so think about what the meeting date represents in all of these scenarios. So number 1, you have an initial evaluation. The student is determined to be eligible, but the parent has agreed to the upper fate, and potentially you're going to have more meetings. So what is that meeting date driven off of? 60-day timeline. So say it again. So I heard 60-day timeline. What else? It's actually the date that the meeting was initiated. Okay, so it's the date, the very first date that the meeting was initiated, not the continuance meeting. Okay.
The initial meeting date, can you actually?
Yeah. Correct, not the date it was scheduled, the date you actually met.
Okay.
Okay, number 2, student has a triennial eligibility evaluation and it's found to be ineligible. What would the date be? The date you hold the triennial, right? Okay, number 3, an annual plan review is scheduled, is pending, but it's now overdue, late. So think about this, because these are records you're going to have to input directly into CALPADS if you want our monitoring teams to know about this. Okay, so what is the pending as of date? Because you're not going to populate a meeting date because you haven't had a meeting yet. Okay, you're going to populate the pending as of date in that record. But what does that pending as of date need to be? What do you base it on?
Your projected thing.
Did you hear today? Yeah, today. It's not projected meeting day. It's like, I'm telling you, CALPADS, that as of August 30th, I was supposed to hold this meeting, and now it's late, and here's why. Here's the delay. Okay, so that's what we are recommending that you use. Don't use the date the meeting was scheduled. You should use the current date. Okay. And then lastly, if a plan review and a triennial eligibility reevaluation are held on the same day, what is the meeting date?
The date
it was held, and it's 1 record, not 2. Okay, 1 record with 1 date. Okay, this last quiz has to do with plan and service records. Okay, so this is the last time I'm going to make you do this. Now, the only time, and we talked about this over and over, the only time we're expecting plan and service records is when the parent has consented to something. Okay, so when the student is initially evaluated and the parent approves the initial plan, we expect plan and services. If the student's plan has changed in any way, okay, that's amendments to the least restrictive environment components, so general ed participation, program setting, any service changes, transition indicators, anytime any of those things have changed, we expect a subsequent plan record with a different plan effective start date come up for those amendments. If a student transfers into a new LEA and is already on a plan, you guys know that as adoption in SACE. You have to adopt the plan that is in stay put until you either amend it or hold a plan review to change it, okay? Student transfers to or from private schools. Okay, so one of the things I want to tell you, how many of you have had major trouble with private school transfers in CALPADS in terms of the data and the enrollment? Okay, the Flash 193 is like 6 pages long, and it tells you all of these really specific directions about enrollments that you need, and you have to create the enrollments, and you have to adopt the plan, because again, they're coming from an ISP to a public school, and until there's an IEP developed, that ISP is in stay put, except CALPADS has errors that will pop up if you try to adopt an ISP in a public school, right? You can't. So we have to create all these enrollments, and then you have to no-show the enrollment, or you have to delete the enrollment after, you know, you've held the meeting. It's just, bottom line is, after this year, once this year starts, you can throw away Flash 193. You don't ever have to refer back to it, because we're changing that process. Okay, so what it means essentially is that the plan that the student is on when they enter your LEA, when they enroll in, you can adopt that plan as is at whatever school they're enrolled at. So if they're on an ISP and they move to a public school, you can adopt the plan type 200 at that new school, at the public school, but guess what? Only for 30 days. Then CALPADS is going to start generating an error saying, hey, we don't expect this kid to be on an ISP at a public school. We need a subsequent plan record with a plan type of IEP, okay, plan type 100. And the same for private schools. They can only be on that IEP for 30 days until an ISP is developed. But what that does is it creates a seamless plan record from the time of enrollment in your school. Yes.
But what if you're not offering the service that is on their ISP?
So if you're not, what if the school's not offering the services that are in their ISP? Again, whatever is in that plan is in stay put until you amend it, send out an amendment, or you held a plan review and created something else. So that's what's there. Now, if you hold a meeting prior to the student enrolling in the public school, then that plan could be in place on the day that you enter, right? So you could enter a new plan. In that case, you wouldn't have to adopt it. And we don't force you to do it. But the point is that once you enroll them, there has to be an overlapping plan if they were already participating in special education. Okay, so it'll make sense when we go through this scenario. This last one, I don't want you to worry about too much. This is when a charter school or a district changes SELPAs. What we're actually going to require in CALPADS is that you create new records for all the kids under that district or under that charter school with the new SELPA code and a new plan effective start date. But your vendors are going to take care of that on the back end. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that. Now, we don't expect plan and services records when they exit special education or when they're not eligible after initial evaluation. Okay, so these scenarios, tell me yes or no, 3 minutes. Do we expect plan and services in these scenarios? So talk to your folks. Okay, so again, we may not have gotten through all of these, but we're gonna go through them together. And I do have a question in the chat that I want to address really quickly. So the question in the chat is, what if you don't know the child is transferring to a private school, if the parents disenrolled or pulled the student but hasn't provided any information on where they're going? So how do people find out what happens to kids in your district? Okay, but who usually does it? Your attendance staff. Okay, so your attendance staff has a responsibility if kids are supposed to be coming to school and they no longer are there, your attendance staff are required to do a comprehensive investigation. The student cannot be exited until that occurs. Okay, so the people that will likely find out first are your attendance staff. And where does that information get entered? SIS. Does it always get to you guys, special education staff, in a timely manner?
No.
Okay, that means you have to collaborate and talk to each other. Again, when you have private school transfers, whether or not the student is attending a private school in your district is going to drive what you have to do. Okay, let's say they transferred to a private school in another district. Are you going to be required to offer an ISP to that student if they're going to a private school in another district? The answer is no. No, you don't. The district where the private school is located is responsible for the identification, in some cases, evaluation and provision of service to that student. Okay, so if you've got a T180, which is a transfer to a private school in the SIS, and they're in another district, don't worry about it. But what if they transfer to a private school within your district? Then yes, you have to make the offer of services through an ISP to that parent. Okay, so my point is to the person on Zoom who asked this question is you have to collaborate with your attendance staff, because where they've found out that they've gone to a private school, and if it's located in your district, then you have a responsibility to make the offer of that proportionate share of services to the student through an individualized service. No, their district of residence are responsible for the offer of FAPE, which means if you come to school in my district where you live, we can provide free and appropriate public education.
But if that
Yes, that's correct. Now, the district of residence is always going to be responsible for making the offer of FAPE. Okay, but the district of location is the one that will provide services through an ISP if the parent elects. Did you want to say something about that?
I
Yeah.
do, only for those of you in our SELPA, to kind of filter this out, we have our own agreement within our.
Okay,
SELPA.
yeah, so you have,
Depending on all.
yes. So in Sonoma County, they have a special arrangement on within the county, Sonoma County. So talk to Sherry about the specific process within Sonoma County. Okay, but what I'm reciting to you is IDEA law. Okay. But you follow IDEA law, you just have your own special arrangement given the makeup of your county, right? Okay. So scenario one, students on an IEP transfers to a new district. Do we need plan and service records? Yeah, that's the adoption. Do this. So when you're adopting a plan, you are going to need new plan and services. Sorry. Okay, student has an initial evaluation in June prior to entry into kindergarten. The parent accepts the offer of FAPE and the student is going to start services in the fall. Do you need plan and services? Yes. Okay. 3, student has an exit meeting and exited from special education. Do we need plan and services? No, because they're exiting. They will not have a subsequent class. A student who's on an IEP at a public school is parentally placed in a private school. A meeting to discuss the ISP is pending. Okay, do we need plan and services? Okay, remember we just talked about whatever is in place is in stay put. So the answer is yes. So if there's a pending meeting, you're still going to need to adopt whatever is in stay put. Okay. 5, an IEP is amended to correct one of the transition indicators. Do we need plan and services? Because it's an amendment. Student has an annual plan review, but the parent has not yet consented to or signed the IEP. Do we need plan or services?
No, we're in state.
Well, it's not a stay put, because in this case, oh, yes, you're right, yes. Whatever plan is there is in stay put until the parent has agreed something else, so you're right, absolutely. Okay, student is initially evaluated and is found ineligible. Do we need plan and services? No, we do not. And then 8, a student who was on an ISP at a private school transfers to the public school, and let's just say in this case, the meeting happens prior to the entry into the public school. Doesn't always happen. Okay. But before they come back, the team meets and the parent says, no, I do not want to be on an IEP. Do we need plan and services for this affair? No, we don't. All right. In these 4 scenarios, we were expecting plan and services. So now what I want you to think about, and this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of where state is going to pull these records, whether you're going to be required to populate something or they're pulling it from somewhere. These are the questions that you want to ask state, because I'm telling you what we require, what we expect. How state is pulling this information is going to be a question for state. All right, so in the first scenario, what we want to think about is what would the plan effective date be based on? If the student on an IEP transfers to the new district, what do we expect the plan effective start date to be in that record? Date they enrolled in the district. Do I hear anything else? The date the IEP what? The date the IEP was last held is what I heard. Okay, when you are adopting an IEP, it should be based on the date that they're enrolling in your district. Okay, now, does SACE capture the enrollment date? Okay, do your case managers always populate it? No. Okay, so you need to talk to SACE because it is required. So now it's required. Okay, so meaning if they don't populate it, you can't send a transaction up to CALPADS. Okay, so now it is a required data. I'm sorry?
We can't request the data from the other district without putting in the enrollment date for our district. If
Okay,
they won't let you.
so we can't even request a transfer unless we put in an enrollment date. We talked about that earlier, so that's good. Okay, so now that enrollment date will be in there, so very likely when they're doing those adoptions, that's the date that states will be using. Confirm that with states though, okay? But that is our expectation, because that means the student will have an active plan at your school from the day of enrollment. And then if you, in 30 days, within that 30-day period, you amend it or adopt something else, not adopt, but have a plan review and submit a subsequent plan, you can do that. But there won't be any gaps. Second, student has an initial evaluation in June prior to entry into kindergarten. The parent accepts the offer of faith and the student's going to start services in the fall. What is the plan effective start date?
First day of school in the fall.
Okay, first day of school in the fall. Now, this is a kindergarten student. And parents like to kindergarten shop. They like to shop around and enroll their kid at several different places sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So when that happens, the question here is, when should you send up the plan record? When should they be sent up?
After 5 days of school start.
Okay, after school starts. Here's the issue is in CALPADS, we actually allow these records to come up with future effective start dates. So if I held a meeting in June, okay, so right now, here's one of the current constraints of our system. You have to decide right now, based on the current architecture, if I hold a meeting in June for an initial evaluation for a kid who's going to start in the fall, I have to make a decision. I have to say, do I want to report this meeting in June because I've held the meeting and I've met my 60-day timeline, or do I want to wait until fall and report everything at once? We forced you to do that because meetings and plans are combined in this said record. Now you have the ability to send up a meeting record in June to say, I've met my statutory requirement, but you can wait until fall to send up the plan record. You can't send them both up together, and the plan effective start date would be in the future. But what happens if they don't come to your school? Okay, what it's going to do is it's going to create errors for another district who's trying to submit up a plan, because that's actually where the kid's going. So I would recommend in these situations that you wait. Just wait until you're ensured that they're actually enrolling and coming to that school. So future effective start dates are going to probably cause problems if kids don't show up. All right, so in this case, it is going to be the first day of enrollment, but try not to send up those records until you're sure that they're coming. All right, 3, students who are
Randy,
who's on
just,
IEP in a public school. What? Go ahead, Joe.
Randy, just kind of like a follow-up questions, because we're getting questions regarding the effective start date in those
Sure.
kind of regards. If the student transfers to a new district and they don't know whether the student is actually, in special education or identified as special education, they later learn about it, then that should be when the parent would agree, or when the student actually is found to be in special education.
Okay, so kid transfers into my school. Parent doesn't disclose they're on an IEP, and so I don't immediately adopt that record. So what do I do in those cases when 2 months later down the line we find out that the kid was on an IEP? And the answer to that question is we're going to still need to fill that gap. So what was in stay put? The previous IEP was still in stay put. So you're still going to need to adopt it with a plan effective start date of the date that they enrolled in your school. And if their annual was due during that time, what does that mean? It means that you're late. Okay, so we're going to talk about, right after this, we're going to talk about mechanisms to avoid that happening. I'm going to tell you exactly how to avoid that from happening, and CALPADS is great for that reason. There are 2 ways that you can find out that a student is on an active IEP without having the data in SAFE. You can use CALPADS for that, and I'll talk about it in a minute. Okay, so 3, students who's on an IEP at a public school is parentally placed in a private school, and a meeting to discuss the ISP is pending. What would that plan effective start date be based on? Yes, you said it. First day of enrollment at the private school. Okay, the date that they enrolled in the private school is the date, because they're already on an IEP, and that IEP is going to be in stay put until you amend their plan and put them on an ISP. Okay, so first date, same thing. If they're going to a private school, the first day of enrollment. If they're going to a public school, first day of enrollment. Or IEP is amended to correct one of the transition indicators. What is the plan effective start date based on?
Date of the amendment?
Yeah, amendment date, right? And that's pretty easy in SAFE, right? The meeting date and the meeting type is amendment in those cases. Okay, so you have an idea of what we are expecting. Now, how do you resolve all these errors? And the bottom line is, I can't tell you how to do that, because it's dependent on how SAFE has implemented a lot of these procedures. So they're going to have to tell you, when you get this particular error, you need to go look in this part of SAFE, you need to change this field, and then regenerate the transaction. So SAFE is going to be responsible for really helping you understand how to resolve these particular types of errors. They've been provided all of the errors. Now this link, and one of the meeting materials that you'll find, is a spreadsheet that just has all of the new errors. It's all of the special education errors that you're going to get as part of the redesign. Okay, and it's going to give you a little more information that's actually in the error list. Okay, there's a column in there that provides you the trigger, which tells you exactly what field, the criteria that we're looking for, and if it doesn't meet those criteria, it's going to generate an error. Okay, so you can utilize this. It's probably going to change a little bit and evolve because we're still going through user acceptance testing and we're finding bugs in promoter validation. So it could potentially change, but 99%, it's pretty solid. So you can use that as a reference when you start getting these errors to figure out what they mean. Now, it says new fall reports. but really they're not new. They just have new numbers. Okay, so for fall, 16.1 is no longer. So 16.1, 16.2, 16.3, 16.5, 16.6, all the old reports, they will still be there. You're still going to see them in the menu. They will only generate for years 22, 23, and prior. They're not going to generate for 20, 23, 24, and after. You're going to have to use these new reports. So 16.1 is replaced by 16.12. For fall, this 16.12 will no longer allow you to see 700, 800, 900 plan types or pending. This is only going to be active kids who are eligible and participating and are to be counted in your child count. Those are the only kids that will show up in this report. 16.13 is the count by federal setting, and this is the same report, just new number. It replaces 16.2. 16.14 is your student list. It replaces 16.3. The only changes we made to this report is we actually had to add some columns because now we have the new file types and new fields within each of those file types. Okay. Again, your student list for fall. Yes, Sherry. Okay, so has the logic been updated to exclude no-shows if they are not eligible? Not eligible?
No, eligible. You put an eligible, but then there's no show.
Okay, so the answer to that question is, so they're eligible and you've got an enrollment in there, but you put a no-show. The answer is no, the logic hasn't changed. Here's why. Because remember when you're creating those enrollments in your student information systems, particularly if they're school age, okay, if they're school age. And these are particularly, let's say preschoolers. Yeah, they're preschool age. So if they're preschool age and they're not actually attending your school, the reason that your clerks use that no-show code is because in the SIS, it requires like course records, it requires attendance records, and that's why they use that no-show code. It's just to say, this kid has an enrollment, but they're not actually attending school, right? They're receiving services. So that the answer to that question is, you will, as long as they're eligible, we will still use an enrollment within a 470 code. If you can think of scenarios where that doesn't work and it causes issues, please tell me, and then we'll try and work through it. Okay, 16.15 replaces 16.5, which is your service report. And then the corresponding student services list. 16.16 is the new number, replaces 16.6. The only change we made here was that now instead of meeting or amendment identifier, we have the plan effective start date, which is the link to the plan record. Okay. We will also make available as part of this redesign, starting on September 19th, the operational data store extracts. For those of you on the SPED side, how many of you have used the ODS extracts in CALPADS? Okay, so a few of you, and the rest of you are like, what the heck is ODS? All right, so anytime you have an enrollment for a student, okay, you own that student. What we allow you to do is pull out all of the associated data for that student, okay? So if you want to see a history of their statuses and their plans and their meetings, then you can, as long as you have that student enrolled, you can pull files out of CALPADS that gives you all of that history. And these are going to be really important for reconciliation when we initially launch this. So again, me and my team are going to come up with some strategies to help you utilize these extracts. You can pull them out of CALPADS and you can say, okay, how many statuses of eligible and participating do I have in the SWDS? And does that correspond with my number in states? How many IEPs do I have in my plans? And then does that correspond with the number in states? Okay, so we're going to come up with some strategies for you. So, but that's what those are for. Okay, we are making those available. We are still going through user acceptance testing. Okay, so that has been going on since March, and it will continue probably through the 15th of September, right before we launch the system. In fact, they just turned on the new academic year, and I'll be sending a message to the vendors in the staging site and the testing site, so now they can actually see data in the report being generated, so we can figure out whether or not the reports are doing what they're supposed to do. All right, last thing. preparing for this year-end rollover, preparing for September 19th. Okay, after you attend that SACE training and you get an idea of how SACE has implemented some of these processes, you have to start thinking about how you're going to train your case managers and make them understand that now meetings and plans have been decoupled. They're different. And it may require a change in what they normally do in that system, depending on what SACE says. Okay. Also, those pending, there has to be a process. Remember, for annuals and triennials, if those meetings are late and you want to tell CDE why, that record is not going to get automatically sent up there. Somebody actually has to log in and do it. So you have to develop a process where, and SACE has said, we're giving them the information. We're telling them on the dashboard, hey, these meetings are late. And we're also telling you, you need to go in and enter a delay code. Okay. So they're giving you the visibility, but a person has to know that once that meeting delay code is entered, that they actually need to log into CALPADS and send up the record if you want CDE to have that information. Okay. So it's, again, training them on that. All right. So our end of year window ended on the 25th. Okay. So we're done with end of year 4 this year. And now we're moving into and towards the new academic year. So amendments for kids who entered kindergarten and were 5 years old, or who entered kindergarten and will turn 5 years old before census day. How many of you have actually created amendments for these to change their setting? Yes. Okay. Sherry has. All right. I'm telling you, you have to do this now. Because if you wait to do it and they've entered kindergarten and before census day, if they're 5 years old in transitional kindergarten or kindergarten, and they're 5 years old, on census day, you're going to have to submit an amendment. You're going to have to. And it's even more problematic if their annual IEP happens in between that time. Because if you hold your annual IEP and you haven't done that amendment, then you're going to have to put in a ticket to SACE, and SACE is going to have to manually correct the record. Okay, so go back to your districts, find out which kids are in transitional kindergarten and are age 5 or are getting ready to turn 5 before census day. Submit up amendments as of the date that they were both of those things in transitional kindergarten and 5. Submit those amendments now. Don't wait until their annual IEPs are held, because it will save you guys a lot of time. That's the first thing. Next thing, and lastly, remember how I told you I was going to tell you, how do I figure out if a student is a student with disabilities, even if the parent hasn't told me that they're on an IEP? How do I do it? Does anybody know?
One of those extras.
It's one of those extracts. Anybody know the name of the extract? I mean, it's on the screen, but.
Was it the SSI?
Yes. Okay. There's
You also
two
had
ways.
the template.
2 ways to do this, guys. So, for those of you, has everybody started school here already?
Yeah.
Okay. So your CALPADS administrators have already uploaded all of the new enrollment for the academic year. If you've already started school, you know which kids are here by this point, right? So you know which kids are going to be enrolled in your district. So what you can do is either ask your CALPADS administrator or ask them to give you the rights to download something called the SSID extract. So what that does is for every kid, every enrollment that you have in there, that SSID extract provides a lot of demographic information about that student that's already in CALPADS, even if you didn't enter it. Okay, and one of the columns is students with disabilities, yes or no. Okay, so what that means is I can do a comparison. If I take all of the kids, students with disabilities, yes, and I do a comparison with what is in SAFE, and I don't see records for some of those kids, what do I have to do?
Get them in.
Adopt the IEP, but you need to do it now. Use that information because that will tell you, even without the cube, even without parent telling you, it's going to tell you that that student is a student with disabilities, and I need to adopt their IEP as of what date? First day of school. Okay, so that's one way. So utilize the SSID extract. Now is the perfect time to do it. Second, on your monitoring report, if you've submitted an enrollment, and on your monitoring reports, you're seeing kids on that report with a different SELPA code, that SELPA code is telling you, that different SELPA code is telling you that you don't have the Fed records in there for you, that you haven't adopted anything. Okay, so your monitoring reports can also give you that information. And the monitoring reports are refreshed every single day. Okay, so if you're seeing a SELPA that you don't belong to, that means you don't have their SPED information in there. So there's two ways I just told you. Either get the SSID extract on a regular basis, or look at your monitoring reports. Because as long as there's an enrollment in there and you don't have the associated plan, because that's what it's going to require, a new plan record. If you don't have the plan record, then that student is going to show up in a different SELPA on that report. Okay, and that's two ways. You don't even have to work with the CALPADS administrator to look at the monitoring reports as long as you have access to it. Okay, so 3 minutes to spare. Yes. Okay. Any lingering questions? I always do this. Okay, so I am now over halfway through. We've got sessions in Contra Costa tomorrow, and then I'll be in Southern California the following week, and Lake County and Tulare County after that. I believe that Ventura County is hosting a virtual session, and I believe Orange County is hosting a virtual session. So if you would like, or if you know people, if you want to suffer through this again, please don't worry. But if you have people that you think would benefit that were not able to come today, please have them inquire with those counties to register for their virtual session, and they can participate. Okay. Otherwise, I want to say thank you to Sherry and her staff. Thank you so much for everything today. Thank you guys for not falling asleep, or at least that I saw. And we will. We put a lot of work in. And thanks, folks on Zoom.
Brandy,
We will.
would
Do
you
we
be
have
able to
questions?
answer? Yes, we have some lingering questions. Just questions about the plan effective start date.
Okay.
So can you please clarify what the plan effective start date is throughout this training? One moment is the date parent signed, and the next it's the day of the meeting.
Okay. Plan effective start date. Plan effective start date. Our intent is to reflect the date that plan and services started for a student. Okay, so let's say you're in the middle of the school year, you have an initial evaluation, the parent agrees to the offer of faith, that plan and services start on the meeting date, right? It's the same date. But we talked about other scenarios where you hold a meeting in June, the kid doesn't start services until the fall. So the student is eligible, but they're not participating until services start in the fall. So in that case, the plan effective start date would be the first day of school. Okay. So it really is the date that plan and services will start for that student and be in effect. Okay.
And
so
that should be the same as what the addendums as well, right, Brandy?
I'm sorry, amendment?
Yeah, amendments, it would be the same thing, right?
Right, the plan effective start date for an amendment is the date that amendment is made.
All right, thank you.
Okay. All right, now, thank you. And thanks everybody on Zoom for maybe not falling asleep, but I couldn't see you. So have a great week, you guys. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Milo. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much, Brandy and Sherry and the rest of your team there. Thank you very much
Thank you
for
very
hosting
much.
this.
And we will see you later.
Okay.